Hi, so I just got a very cool checkmate, the sickest checkmate of my life, I think, and it started from this position, and you can tell from this position that black probably already has a pretty strong attack because there's this alignment of the bishop with the king. The bishop and the queen are both targeting this square. This knight is ready to jump into the action. There's only one piece defending this square, the rook, and um, the move that I'm looking at in this position is knight to g3, which the pawn can't take because it's pinned to the king by the bishop. If the pawn takes, then the king is in check, so that move isn't legal. But I can't play bishop. I can't play knight to g3 right away because the bishop defends that square. If I played knight to g3, the bishop would just take, and I'd be down a piece and be very sad. So the first move that I played is pawn to e5, which cuts off this diagonal, um, and it also opens up an attack on the bishop. And so now the bishop has to either be defended or it has to retreat. The only move to defend the bishop is bringing this knight out to defend it. Um, and if you retreat, you have to retreat to one of these two squares because this one's covered by the pawn. White didn't choose to defend, he chose to retreat, so he played his bishop back to a3, and now I go ahead and play knight to g3 as planned. And obviously the threat here right away is to just take the rook and win the exchange, as they say. The rook is better than the knight, so you don't really want to lose a rook for a knight. And the only way to save the rook is to play rook to e1, which leads to checkmate, as you'll see. Rook to e1 is the move that my opponent plays. It turns out that the best move is not to save the rook and get checkmated. It's to bring your knight in and target this really weak square in white's position. If white could teleport his knight to this square somehow, I'd be in trouble because my king would be in check. It would also be attacking this bishop, so I'd be losing a piece after my king moves. And I can't take with the queen because that square is defended by the bishop, so it would be a very annoying piece there, and that's the way white should proceed. Just lose the rook and get a very powerful knight. But white doesn't do that. White saves the rook, and this does lead to checkmate, as you'll see. And there are two moves that I considered here. One is queen takes, the other is bishop takes. In the game, I considered queen takes first, but I couldn't find a follow-up that was leading to checkmate. I thought that after the king came to h2, that there wouldn't be a follow-up that led to checkmate. I couldn't find one. It turns out there is one, and I will show it. But the move that I played was bishop takes, and the king can't take back, obviously, because the bishop's defended by the queen. And these two squares are covered by the knight, so there's only one square for the king to move to. It's the only legal move. The bishop can't be taken by any pieces, so the king has to be moved. And when I was back a few moves ago, back in this position, I considered just winning the rook, winning the exchange anyway after the king moved, because I can win it with the bishop. But I found a checkmate, and the move that leads to checkmate is queen to f4, lining up with the king. The threat here is playing knight to f1, which is double check. If I could somehow, if it was my move right now and I played knight to f1, it would be checkmate. I mean, it wouldn't be checkmate right away, but it would lead to checkmate. And it's double check, as I mentioned. The knight is giving check and the queen is giving check, so you can't take the knight because the king would be in check. Yeah, and it turns out that that's a unstoppable threat. The knight is coming here, the king will have to move here because the square is still covered by the bishop, and then the queen will come in with checkmate. So there are two moves to think about in this position, and the first one is queen to f3, which is what my opponent played. I'm going to show the checkmate that happened in the game first. And the idea is bring the queen in, defend some squares around the king, try and trade off queens. Hopefully, maybe black takes the queen and then the attack fizzles out. But it turns out that that move does not stop knight to f1. And yeah, after knight to f1, as I mentioned earlier, it's double check. So the knight can't be taken because the queen would be giving check, and the queen can't be taken because the knight is giving check. So the king has to move. These two squares are off limits. So this is the only square the king can move to. And then after king to h1, it's the checkmate that I achieved in the game. Queen to h2. It's being defended by the knight, so the king can't take. And yeah, it's checkmate. The king is very checkmated, 3 pieces around it. And all of the rooks on white's back rank and this queen defending the pawns around the king is not helping the king at all. The pieces just slip in and it's checkmate. The other move to consider in this position is knight to f3. And after knight to f3, knight to f1 still leads to checkmate. It's the double check I mentioned earlier. So the king has to move, and the idea of knight to f3 is now the knight is covering the square. So queen to h2 is no longer checkmate because the knight will take. However, it turns out that after the knight takes, now knight to g3 is checkmate because the king can't move here, obviously, because there's a knight there, and there's a pawn here, and this square is covered by the bishop. So this is just checkmate. Very, very cool checkmate. I wish this one had happened instead. It's kind of like a smothered mate. So yeah, there's no defense against checkmate from here. Real quick, back in this position, I said I couldn't find a follow-up from here. But it turns out that there is a follow-up. In this position, this is the only legal move. The queen can't be taken. It's defended by the bishop. Can't be taken by the king, and there's no other pieces that can take. And then after the king moves here, it's just the same idea as before. The queen comes down, and there's still no defense against the same ideas. If this queen, comes to try to trade off, then it's still just this checkmate. The only difference is that the bishop is back here instead of right here, but it's still doing its job of defending that square. And if the knight comes in, it's still the same exact idea. This double check. This square is cut off by the queen. This square is still cut off by the bishop, so the king has to move here. And then it's still checkmate after this because the bishop still covers this square. So I didn't find that one either. But I'm still very happy with the checkmate I did find. Definitely the sickest checkmate I've ever come up with, and a very fun game. Thanks for watching.